All right, guys, we'll just give some time here for people to get logged in. Well, I hope everyone had a nice Sunday and was able to spend some quality time with your moms or that special female someone in your lives. My kids were good, and we went for a nice walk outside of Devon and got rained on quite a bit, but that was okay. It was a very nice day. Saw both sets of grandparents, so it was very nice. All right, so guys, we are going to continue on with the nervous system. I'll just wait a minute because there's still a few people. Oh my goodness, awesome. 14 of you so far, that's very good. So we're going to continue on with the nervous system today. And just an announcement. So we'd finished the neurons, other than I said I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the impact on drugs with neurons. So we'll do a little quick activity with that. Well, watch a video and talk about it. But I've decided just with COVID and everything and quizzes that your neuron quiz, which I was going to open up for you guys tomorrow, what I've decided to do is I'm going to just combine the quiz. So instead of just being a neuron quiz, it'll be a neuron and then CNS PNS quiz, which is our next section that we're going to talk about. And we'll start working on that today. So you will not have a quiz this week. Your quiz will be next week, Tuesday through Thursday, because there's no classes on Monday. And that'll be on the neuron section and the brain and CNS PNS section. Okay, so I will post that after this class so you're able to read about that. Yeah, so one last quiz. So that should be okay for everyone. So you don't have a quiz this week for me. It'll be next week, just on a little bit more material. Because honestly, there's not a huge amount of material to remember in the brain or CNS PNS notes anyway. All right, that being said, we're going to, oops. I'm going to share the mouse party with you. Share computer sound. So this talks a little bit. So this is a link that just in your guys's PowerPoint for neurons. And I think I just have to turn on flash here. I think. Okay. There we go. So what we see here is mice at a party with a whole bunch of different types of drugs. Each mouse is using a different type of drug. Pot, some are doing meth, some are doing cocaine. So these mice are just hanging out in a lab, and we're going to see what the impact is on the brain of all of these different things. Okay, so let's start off with our little drinking mouse. Okay. What effects alcohol has on the brain?
Inhibitory neurotransmitters called GABA are active throughout the brain. These neurotransmitters act to control neural activity along many brain pathways. When GABA binds to its receptor, the cell is less likely to fire.
Okay, so remember, there's only two neurotransmitters you guys need to know, norepinephrine, and all you need to know is what's in your notes, and then acetylcholine. Okay, but there are other neurotransmitters, obviously. There's quite a few other ones, but for us, we only need to know those two. But this talks, about the effects of drugs with all of these. Let's just put that. Okay, so we're looking at alcohol. So before they talk about the effects of alcohol, they're talking about different neurotransmitters and what their jobs are. So GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which means that it's inhibiting, right? It's going to cause a neuron to become hyperpolarized, right? That's the whole point of GABA, to inhibit it, okay?
Meanwhile, in another area of the brain, another neurotransmitter called glutamate acts as the brain's general-purpose excitatory neurotransmitter.
Okay, so glutamate, another one, excitatory, that means it opens the sodium ion channels, causes the postsynaptic neuron to become depolarized, okay?
When alcohol enters the brain, it delivers a double sedative punch. First, it interacts with GABA receptors to make them even more inhibitory.
Okay, so everything's slowing down. So you've heard of alcohol being turned a depressant. That's why.
Second, it binds to glutamate receptors, preventing the glutamate from exciting the cell.
Okay, so then here's our, I'm just going to slide this so we can see what it is. So it's binding to the glutamate, so glutamate can't excite the cell, right? So that's a problem. So not only is it increasing the inhibitory effect, it's decreasing the stimulatory effect.
Alcohol particularly affects areas of the brain involved in memory formation, decision-making, and impulse control.
So that's where, if you've been drinking too much, that little part of your brain that usually tells you that this is a bad idea gets muffled by the alcohol. So that's where we get this decision-making and impulse control. Alcohol also has a big impact on our cerebellum, which is a part of our brain that's important for balance. Okay, memory formation, that's why people sometimes don't remember some of the things if they've drank too much. Right, so that's alcohol. So that's the neurotransmitters that alcohol is affecting to cause its effect. Okay, so now let's look at pot, simply because this is now legal if you are 18 or over. Oops.
Before marijuana enters the system, inhibitory neurotransmitters are active in the synapse. These neurotransmitters inhibit dopamine from being released.
Okay, so dopamine isn't being released because of these inhibitory neurotransmitters, okay? So this is going on, this is without the pot.
When activated by the body's own native cannabinoid, called anandamide, cannabinoid receptors turn off the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters. Without inhibition, dopamine can be released.
Okay, so this naturally occurs in our body. Okay, dopamine's released because of our own kind of natural THC that we produce called anandamide.
THC, the active chemical in marijuana, mimics anandamide and binds to cannabinoid receptors. Inhibition is turned off and dopamine is allowed to squirt into the synapse.
Okay, so now it's going into the synaptic cleft, so we have all of this dopamine. Dopamine is like a feel-good neurotransmitter, depending on where it is in the brain.
Anandamide is known to be involved in removing unnecessary short-term memories. It is also responsible for slowing down movement, making us feel relaxed and calm. Unlike THC, anandamide breaks down very quickly in the body. That explains why anandamide doesn't produce a perpetual natural high.
So people sometimes will smoke pot to relax, to feel less hungry, so you're calm, or to feel more hungry rather if you're doing chemotherapy and not able to eat very much. All right, so that's the impact it has. One of the things they don't talk about though is it can reduce the development of your prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that's responsible for making good decisions. And in your guys' brains, that part is still developing. It's going to continue to develop. Usually they say for girls up to about the age of 25 and for guys up to about the age of 30. Okay. Okay, I want to look at the LSD mouse.
LSD acts almost exclusively on serotonin neurons. LSD chemically resembles serotonin and elicits its effect by binding to serotonin receptors.
So LSD or serotonin rather, is a neurotransmitter. Again, one we don't have to memorize, but it's like the general feel-good neurotransmitter. So when people are depressed, medication is often prescribed that increase how much serotonin is sitting in the synaptic cleft. Okay.
There are several types of serotonin receptors in the brain. Each is responsible for performing specific functions. LSD interacts with particular receptors, but not always in the same way. Sometimes LSD may inhibit them, and sometimes it may excite them. This is one reason why LSD has complex sensory effects.
So because of this weird functioning of LSD, when someone's on an acid trip, they might imagine that they're the king of the world and it's the best thing ever. They might imagine that there's spiders crawling out of their pores. Okay, so it could be good, it could be bad. You never know what you're going to get with LSD.
LSD and other hallucinogens excite a particular region of the brain known as the locus ceruleus, or LC. A single neuron from the LC may branch into many different sensory areas of the brain. The LC is responsible for feelings of wakefulness and evoking a startle response to unexpected stimulus.
So often people will go without sleep for a period of time if they're on LSD as well, while they're going through their trip. Actually, we're going to talk about heroin. So heroin functions in a similar way to fentanyl. Fentanyl is more deadly than heroin, but it's an opiate.
Before heroin enters the system, inhibitory neurotransmitters are active in the synapse. These neurotransmitters inhibit dopamine from being released.
Okay. One thing you want to take note of is in our brains, just like we have a natural receptor site for THC, we have a natural receptor site for opiates because we have our own naturally produced opiates.
When the body's natural opiates activate opiate receptors, the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters is shut down. Without inhibition, dopamine can be released.
Okay. So we have those, so endorphins are those natural receptors, and you can get an endorphin release for all sorts of different reasons.
Heroin mimics natural opiates and binds to opiate receptors, turning off dopamine inhibition. Dopamine is allowed to flood the synapse, producing immediate feelings of sedation and well-being. Neurons with opiate receptors are in parts of the brain responsible for the transmission of pain signals, stress response, and emotional attachment. Our body's opiates are natural painkillers, effective when we have sustained massive injury. This is why morphine, a drug related to heroin, is used as a painkiller.
And that's why fentanyl, another opiate, is used as a painkiller as well. And it's still being prescribed as painkillers, but it just takes such a small little dose of it in order to kill you, so you have to make sure you're under a doctor's care. Okay, we'll just do one more, and we'll just talk about our little ecstasy mouse.
Serotonin transporters are responsible for removing serotonin molecules from the synaptic cleft after they have done their job.
All right, so just to give you a little, I just want to talk to you about this a bit. So this is before we talk about ecstasy. Serotonin uptake. So these guys take up serotonin, so it goes back into the synaptic knob. And then there's less serotonin in the synaptic cleft. So again, someone who is getting treated for depression, often with those drugs, the point of those drugs is to increase the amount of serotonin that's in the synaptic cleft. So there's a group of those drugs that are called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which means for certain serotonins selected, it prevents the reuptake. So they don't go back into the synaptic knob, so it keeps more serotonin here in the synaptic cleft. Just because antidepressants are prescribed often, I thought I'd just give you a sense for how that works.
Ecstasy mimics serotonin and is taken up by serotonin transporters. In fact, ecstasy is more readily taken up than serotonin itself. This interaction with ecstasy alters the transporter. The transporter becomes temporarily confused and starts to do its job in reverse. The transporter starts transporting serotonin out of the cell. The excess serotonin becomes trapped in the synaptic cleft. As a result, it binds again and again to the receptors, overstimulating the cell. Ecstasy affects serotonin pathways responsible for mood, sleep, perception, and appetite. Ecstasy also indirectly interacts with the reward pathway. The excess serotonin stimulates a milder release of dopamine along the reward pathway, giving ecstasy slightly addictive properties.
All right. Some of the problems with ecstasy and with any street drug is that, I'm going to show this off here, is that you are never quite sure what you're getting and what it's being cut with. And there was a boy that I taught my very first year of teaching in Black Gold, and years later, he and a girlfriend, he was finished or close to finishing an engineering degree, decided they would try ecstasy for the first time, and she threw up and he didn't. And it caused his brain to overheat to the point that he sustained fairly major brain damage. So it is something you want to be cognizant of if you decide that you want to mess around with this stuff. Okay, so that's just a little bit. I like to show that just so we get a sense of, if you decide to take some of these drugs, you really have to watch, like, it is going to affect your neurotransmitters. And if you're taking drugs that are already having an impact with your neurotransmitters, who knows what that double whammy is going to be with you. So you really want to make sure that you're making good and informed choices. Okay, so we're going to start talking about the brain. Okay, so this is our next section here. So again, your quiz will be on this and the neurons. And I'm just going to open this up so we can actually see what I'm doing here. Okay. All right, so nervous system. So we're going to talk about two main branches of the nervous system, the central nervous system known as the CNS and the peripheral nervous system known as the PNS. Okay, so that's what our focus is for this section. So just to give you a little bit of what we're doing from the curriculum, you're expected to be able to identify the principal structures of the central nervous system and explain the functions. So with the brain, that includes our cerebral hemispheres, left and right hemispheres, the lobes that make up the cerebrum, the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the hypothalamus. So those are the major regions that you're responsible for, and then understanding the spinal cord and what its focus is. You don't have to know parts of the spinal cord, just know that it is and what it does, okay? You also need to know the branches of the peripheral nervous system and explain their functions in regulating both our voluntary, known as somatic, and involuntary, known as our autonomic systems, okay? So we'll get into all of that stuff as we work through this one. So the two systems we're looking at are autonomic and sensory somatic, and then autonomic branches off into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and then our sensory somatic, okay? So that's what we're responsible for. So first we're going to just look at our general branches. So if we have our nervous system is branched, like what we said right at the very beginning of all this, is branched with our central nervous system and our peripheral. Okay, so those are the two branches of our nervous system, and then they have their own sub-branches. So we're going to start today by just talking about the central nervous system. Okay, so in our central nervous system, so here's our two main branches. I'm just going to move that down for a second. So our central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. So that's what we see colored in blue here. So our brain is blue, our spinal cord is blue. That's our central nervous system. Our peripheral, we see the yellow. All of these nerves that we see here, those are all part of our peripheral nervous system, okay? So our brain and spinal cord, and then our peripheral. So we're going to watch just a little video here describing the differences and what those mean. And I believe I have it, whoops, up here.
Science, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the divisions of the nervous system. There are two major divisions of the nervous system. The first is the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The second is the peripheral nervous system, which consists of nerves that run throughout the body. The peripheral nervous system itself is made up of two subdivisions. The first is the somatic nervous system, which contains nerves that carry sensory signals from the body to the central nervous system, and nerves that carry motor signals from the central nervous system to the skeletal muscles. The somatic nervous system is associated with voluntary movement. When you clicked on this video to play it, the signal to depress your finger was sent from your brain to your finger via the somatic nervous system. The second division of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is sometimes called the involuntary nervous system, and it is involved in regulating the internal environment of the body. It carries signals from internal organs to the central nervous system, and from the central nervous system to the internal organs. In this way, it is involved in regulating things like digestion and heartbeat, which are generally outside the realm of conscious control. The autonomic nervous system can be further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve fibers. The sympathetic nervous system plays a large role in stimulating and mobilizing energy resources, while the parasympathetic nervous system acts to conserve energy. For example, if you're in a frightening situation, the sympathetic nervous system will cause your heart rate to increase, your blood pressure to increase, and your sweat glands to be stimulated. If you're eating a meal, however, and are not frightened, your parasympathetic nervous system will stimulate digestion, increase salivation, and slow your heart rate. Due to these functions, the sympathetic nervous system is often described as being involved in fight or flight responses, while the parasympathetic nervous system is described as being involved in rest and digest responses.
Alrighty, that is that. Okay, so just cancel this and go back to our slideshow. So that's just a little summary of what we're going to be talking about. Okay. So with our central nervous system, we subdivide that into the brain and the spinal cord. So those are the two main parts of our central nervous system. Our focus today is going to be on the brain. I don't know that we'll get to the spinal cord today. Okay, so first we need to know the major parts of the brain. So when we look at the parts of the brain, we're going to start with the cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebrum is all of this part here that has all of those convolutions in it, right? The lower pieces and the higher pieces, okay? All of those convolutions are in our cerebrum. So we see that all here. So often when we think brain, that's what we think, that's the brain. The brain is more than that, but the cerebrum is a very important part of the brain. It's the part of our brain that processes most of the information that comes from our sensory nerves. And it's the part that will give us that information to send back for our responses to things, okay? So the processing, the analysis, memories are stored there, all of that stuff is happening in the cerebrum. Now, our brain has two halves, a left half and a right half. And those two halves of the brain need something to connect them, okay? Because they're pretty distinct from one another, the two halves of the cerebrum. Okay, so it's the cerebrum that has the two halves. They're connected by this nerve tract, and this nerve tract is white because it's made up of myelinated neurons in our brain, okay? And that nerve tract is called the corpus callosum, okay? So if you look down at a brain and you sort of try to pull apart those two halves of the cerebrum, you'll actually see that white of the corpus callosum underneath. Okay, below that, we have this region. It kind of looks like a little bit of a circle in the brain, and that region is called the thalamus. And the thalamus is really a center that sort of sends messages off, sends and connects messages. So sensory messages are going to travel through the thalamus and then go to the cerebrum to be processed. And then the cerebrum is going to send motor messages through the thalamus, which is going to go down here through the spinal cord. Okay. The region below the thalamus we've talked about already, and that's called the hypothalamus. Remember, hypo less than, so hypo is the region below the thalamus. We know that the hypothalamus produces hormones. It's also responsible for our stress response, so we know that already. So there's certain parts of our nervous system that the hypothalamus is in control of and responsible for. This little thing right below the hypothalamus, just write in chat, what do you think that is? Right below the hypothalamus, what do we think that is? There we go. It is the pituitary, absolutely. So right below the hypothalamus is our pituitary gland, okay? And we know the pituitary is our master gland, produces hormones that are responsible for causing other endocrine glands to make hormones, okay? All right, when we look here, this is the brain stem. So this is the lower part of the brain. Now for us, it goes straight down, right? Because that's where our spine is, and it's gonna go down because it's the spinal cord here. If we're talking about an animal, so when we dissect once upon a time, dissect a sheep brain, the spinal cord actually comes out this way because we've got their head, but their back is where their vertebrae is, so their head's sitting this way, where their back's this way. Our back is this way. Okay, so we have slightly different positioning. Okay, so we have these little bumps. So on the brain stem, there's bumps here, and then the spinal cord. The first bump is something called the pons. Okay, now the pons is another little relay center, and it sends messages back and forth between this structure here called the cerebrum and this structure here called the medulla oblongata. Okay, so it's responsible for sending messages between these two parts and then sending messages this way. Okay, so it's a little relay station. The medulla oblongata, you may or may not have heard of when you took Bio30, but it's responsible for a lot of our autonomic or unconscious functions, such as our heart rate, our breathing rate. So our breathing, the fact that our intercostal muscles and our diaphragm are not under conscious control, comes from the medulla oblongata. Whether our blood vessels constrict or dilate is controlled by the medulla oblongata. Okay, so those are the functions that come from there. And then of course, the spinal cord, which is going to take the messages to and from the PNS, or between the PNS and the brain. Okay. Now this little piece here is called the cerebellum, not the cerebrum, but the cerebellum. The cerebellum is responsible for our sense of balance, muscle tone, posture, okay, and coordinates voluntary muscle action. Because we have to remember that every task we do doesn't usually require a single muscle, but a bunch of muscles working together as a team. The cerebellum helps with that, okay? All right, so we'll start with the brain. So the brain, about 1.4 kilograms, so not 2 pounds, or under 2 pounds, 1.4 kilograms, about 3 pounds, sorry. And about 85% water. It's our central command post. It's pretty jiggly, so they fix the brains that we study in class. So it's pretty jello-y. It really needs to be protected. And one of the major protections of the brain is the skull. So we have these bones in our skull that protect our brain, which is really, really important. Okay. There's another layer of material called the meninges, and the meninges also they wrap around the brain and they wrap around the spinal cord. There's several layers. So there's one layer that just sort of stays right on the brain. It causes the brain to have a bit of a shiny appearance to it. And then there's a layer that's over that. So usually when we dissect the brain, we have to remove that. And then there's a layer that's just under the skull. So there's 3 layers of meninges, and they're filled with fluid. Okay, so there's 3 layers of meninges. I won't make you try to type it because it would be hard, but just think in your head, take a second. What do you think an inflammation or infection of the meninges is called? Think about it for a second. You don't have to type it out. You guys got that in your head? Meningitis. So meningitis is an infection or inflammation of the meninges, okay? All right. Cerebrospinal fluid. So we see here the fluid is in the meninges, and it separates the brain and the skull. So it's between those layers, those 3 meninges layers. So that's where we see it here. There's also spaces in our brain called ventricles, and they're filled with cerebrospinal fluid as well. So it's kind of bathed in this fluid, and then there's fluid here going down with the spinal cord. Okay. Now we want to think about the importance of that fluid. So imagine that we have our brain, right? And we fall down. If we fall down and we don't have any fluid in our brain, then our brain bangs right against our skull. That's bad, right? We need that nice cushiony layer of fluid, so when our brain hits our skull when we fall down, it's actually hitting that fluid and it absorbs that impact, okay? If we have a really strong impact, then that fluid gets pushed aside and we still hit our brain against our skull, and that's usually what's going to be the cause of a concussion, okay? But typically, if we fall, the brain will be that absorbed, that banging against the skull will be absorbed by the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. So it acts as a shock absorber. It's also a transport medium because nutrients and waste will also travel through the cerebrum. Okay, so that's what we see here. Next, we have a lumbar puncture. So lumbar puncture, also known as a spinal tap, there we go, just get this going again. Somehow I lost that. Don't know why it's sitting over there. Okay, let's go back, try this again. Nope, I lost it. Okay, a spinal tap is where this needle, so we can see the needle here. Maybe I can make this, there we go. We see the needle here, and the needle goes between the vertebrae, and it goes right here, and it's collecting a sample of cerebral spinal fluid, okay? So this is typically how they test for meningitis. So if there's an inflammation in the meninges, then there's going to be white blood cells that are hanging out here in the cerebral spinal fluid. There's some cancers of the brain and spinal cord, they're also tested this way. So when my oldest boy got really sick, he had to get a spinal tap when he was 15 months old and to take a sample of that cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so that's what that is. Oh, didn't want to do that. Was that for diagnosing, Noah, your treatment? From what I understand, I don't know if it hurts or not. I didn't actually get to be in the room myself when my son had it done. But is that to give your treatment, Noah, or to for your injections? Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So lumbar punctures, and I guess that's where they want to treat, is that part of your body. So that's probably why the injections go straight there. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Okay, so they take out fluid and add medicine. Huh. And that's something where obviously they need you to be very, very still because they don't want to do any damage to your spinal cord in order for that treatment to happen. Yeah. So because we're talking about this right now, I thought it'd be a good chance for us just to mention what a lumbar puncture is. The lumbar are the vertebrae that are in our lower back. Okay. All right. Now, let's get that back here. Go like this. And delete that. There. Okay. The other thing we have is a blood-brain barrier. So back in Bio30, you learned about your capillaries and you learned about how they're pretty leaky. So stuff can get through other than your blood cells and your proteins. Material can get through. In our brain, they're not nearly as leaky. Little tiny molecules can get through, but big molecules typically don't. And that's to protect our brain. So if we look down here, the little molecules that are in our blood vessels can get out and get into the brain, but the big molecules stay in the capillaries. So when they're doing any kind of treatment of your brain and trying to get any drugs for it, they have to make sure it goes through this, because even if it's a drug that seems like it's going to do a good job on the cells, in a trial that's in a petri dish, unless they actually can get through that blood-brain barrier, it's useless, okay? Now, those drugs we talked about in the mouse party, they can all get through, obviously, otherwise they wouldn't have that impact on the brain, okay? All right, so the cerebrum's our most developed part of the brain. So it has lots of jobs for us. For one of its jobs is to store information, right? So we have sensory information. We can remember an event, a smell, a sound, okay? Control sensory motor action and thoughts. Remember, the cerebrum's the big part that has all the convolutions in it, okay? Sensory information, so we can process information, we can act on information, we can think about things, we have memory. It controls our emotion, our logic, our ability to think through things, other mental activities, all come from our cerebrum. We have a left and right hemisphere, so there's this big split between the left and right. So there's a bit of connective tissue, but they're actually two distinct pieces, our left and our right hemisphere. And then connecting them is the corpus callosum. So that allows communication between the left and the right. What's interesting, and I have no idea why we evolved this way, but our left hemisphere controls the right side of our body, and our right hemisphere controls the left side of our body. Where we really see that is if someone has sustained a stroke, right? So some brain cells have died in one part of their body. So let's say some brain cells have died in the left side of the body, or left side of the cerebrum. Depending on where in the cerebrum that happened, that could mean that some of the muscles in the right side of our body stop working. So one of the signs of stroke, you guys have probably heard about the arms, right? Is put the two arms in front, and if one just slumps and the other one they have control over, right? So you hold the two arms up and then drop, and one kind of just drops without any control at all. That would show, so if this is on the left side of the body, you can imagine that that might happen in the right arm. Or you might notice the right side of the face has become flaccid, so it's drooping, okay? Now that can happen with our senses as well. So maybe we can detect touch in our left arm, in our right arm, left arm, but not our right arm if the damage is here on the left side, okay? All right, now the corpus callosum is white, and it's white because the neurons that are making it up are myelinated. Now remember, the myelin is not made up of Schwann cells in the central nervous system. Okay. All right. Now the cerebral cortex is the outer surface of the cerebrum. So what I like with this is a cross-section of a brain. So we're just looking at a cross-section. And I know it doesn't look gray, but this is the gray matter here. And usually when we dissect the brain in class, I'll have students cut it so they can see what that looks like. But notice how the gray matter follows through all of the convolutions of the brain, okay? And then the white matter is below that. And here we see the connection between the two hemispheres, which is the corpus callosum, okay? And our major processing and understanding is happening here in the cerebral cortex, okay? So that's gray matter. We notice there's lots of folding, and remember, folding is our body's way to increase surface area without increasing the volume that it takes, right? We've seen that in our digestive system, and we've seen that in our respiratory system, right? Increasing surface area. This is where impulses are received and analyzed, so where we figure things out that we're getting messages from, and where we're processing and deciding what we're going to do with that information. Okay, so our cerebrum is divided into 4 lobes. So we need to know each of these 4 lobes. The first of these is called the frontal lobe. So that's the one that's colored in this sort of yellowy orange color, the frontal lobe. So that's right here. Now, one thing we want to remember, because our cerebrum is divided in half, there's a left frontal lobe and a right frontal lobe. There's a left parietal lobe and a right parietal lobe, left occipital, right occipital, left temporal, right temporal, okay? So they're divided. So each hemisphere has the 4 lobes. Our frontal lobe is responsible for voluntary muscle movement, okay? So when you're moving, all of this stuff you're choosing to move, that's coming from our frontal lobe. It's actually a specific region on our frontal lobe right here that's responsible for that. That's called our motor cortex. Okay, you don't have to know that. So the frontal lobe is responsible for that. Written and spoken muscles, our movement of those muscles also comes here. Higher intellectual processing, right? So whether it's a calculus math problem you're trying to figure out, whether you're trying to figure out the meaning of a particular poem that you're reading, whether you're trying to work out how to put all the pieces back together in a motor that you disassembled, all of those things are coming from this higher intellectual processing in our frontal lobe, right? We use that for all sorts of things, whether it's a physical activity, a game you're playing, a board game, an activity game. That's our higher intellectual processing. And then our personality is here in the frontal lobe as well, okay? So, and we'll talk about how they know that in just a, not today. We'll talk about that on Wednesday. Okay, parietal lobe. What I like to think when I think parietal lobe is think of all the senses that are associated with your skin, okay? So parietal lobe, touch, right? So whether we're feeling a gentle touch or a high pressure touch, right? That's our parietal lobe. Pressure, whether we can taste, so imagine your tongue is kind of part of that. So because it's on the surface of our skin. Heat, right? Whether something is hot or cold, we can only detect changes in temperature, but that's happening through our parietal lobe. Pain, right? Parietal lobe. So our parietal lobe processes that. Now I talked about the frontal lobe having a motor cortex here. The parietal lobe has what's called a sensory somatic cortex here. And that's where all those senses get processed that I just talked about. Okay. The temporal lobe, so that's this one here, that's that sort of a darky bluish purple color. The temporal lobe is primarily responsible for hearing, although there is a small little cortex area that overlaps a bit with the frontal lobe that is responsible for us processing a sense of smell. Now we have to remember smell works hand in hand with taste, and we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to our last booklet. Occipital lobe, that's the one here in the back. That's a sort of magenta color. An occipital lobe is the lobe that's responsible for vision, okay? So it processes our vision messages. Now what we want to remember is there's a pathway to the brain before we can perceive these things, right? Until our brain gets that message, we don't have an understanding of something. So if I talk about my eyes and a visual message, so in order for me to get that message, the receptors have to detect the light, the receptors that are in my eye. And then it has to go through my optic nerve. So my optic nerve has to be intact. And then from my optic nerve, that has to make its way to my occipital lobe to be processed. And if there's any breaks in that pathway, then I'm not going to have vision. Okay? All right. So if we look at this image here, so this will be our last slide for today. I'll just do that. All right. So let's start with, so I want you guys to use the chat to tell me which lobe is which. So let's start up here with this one on the upper left side. What lobe is that one? The upper left side. Okay, excellent. So the upper left side is the frontal lobe. Okay. Now here, we're going clockwise through this. So what would this lobe be? The next one. Okay, the one that's colored in this blue color. What lobe is this one? Oops. Excellent. That is our parietal lobe. Okay, good. Just move these so we can actually see that. Okay, and then the one colored in green, what lobe is that one? One colored in green. Oh, sorry. My chat, and that's not, I'm not seeing it here. There we go. Lots of people said this. Okay, the occipital lobe. Sorry about that, guys. And then the last one, the one colored in yellow, temporal lobe. Perfect. All right. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today. We will finish these notes on Wednesday, and then you'll, because we don't have a class Friday. Friday is a PD day. So, and we don't have a class Monday because Monday is Victoria Day. So we'll start the quiz and we'll go from Tuesday to Thursday, but I will have a sheet for you for this after Wednesday's lesson. And then you can have something to review these concepts. All right, so before we sign off, any questions for me? I don't see any, so we will stop there, and you guys have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day, and we will see you guys all on Wednesday. Eric, what we just covered will be on the quiz on Tuesday, so we will include this booklet on the quiz. So Monday and Wednesday's class will both be on the quiz. Yeah, you take it easy too.